Michael, appreciate you coming on the podcast. How you doing?
Well, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm well as well. I'm looking forward to Thanksgiving. Are you a big Thanksgiving guy? What's your do you have a go-to meal on Thanksgiving? Are you just turkey and ham kind of guy?
Yeah, we eat turkey,
Yeah, that's pretty average.
but actually we have a big family thing that goes on down here in Georgia. I went to Georgia Tech. My brother and sister went to UGA, and I got pretty big family, five brothers and sisters,
Nice.
and then me. And yeah, every year, well, it seems as though at least every year, every other year, we have a big family get together, about 20, 25 people, brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, my dad, his wife, so, and then there's the
It's a big
Georgia
crew.
Tech team. Yeah, it's going to be a busy week once Wednesday comes along, and then we
Do
have a
you
big
host?
bowling. Well, Rich is hosting, my brother Rich is hosting this year. He's hosting Thanksgiving, and I'm hosting the Georgia Tech game. And then the following, since Georgia Tech's on Friday, we have a big bowling contest or family bowling event on Saturday. So we rent like 6 lanes you know, and we're a
That's
very
great.
competitive family. So, it's pretty crazy.
That's terrific. It sounds I remember back in the day when Mitt Romney was running for president, we heard all the stories about the Romney families. They had like this family Olympics annually where all their kids would compete. It
No,
sounded brilliant. Didn't really agree
yeah,
with Romney and all
I
his
mean,
politics, but I thought that was nice.
yeah, it's a fun thing. I mean, there's competition over the Georgia Tech game. Which side are you on? Who's going to win? Then there's the bowling event. And then, I mean, people are bowling from age, like, my kids are the youngest, so they'll be 9, 12, up through my dad, who's 80. So the teams get all spread out and
That's cool.
all the scores get tabulated and everything.
Well, I think I mean, those kinds of like family culture elements, I think are really important. And I love that. That's cool to hear. But I mean, we could have a whole podcast just on family culture. But
Yeah, talk about the different ways that we're cooking the turkey.
that's right. That's right. I will say,
We'll have at least two turkeys.
there you go. We told my wife, I admitted to my wife for the first time a couple years ago that I didn't like Thanksgiving meal. And she was like, listen, we don't have to have turkey and ham. Like we can do whatever we want. And it was like this like mind opening experience for me of like, I am an adult. I have my own family. We can do whatever we want. So we started cooking different meals. Like I like Asian food and she would make different things. So that's been that's been a thing we do in the Poppy house now. But but
I got
hey,
a similar story on Christmas.
yeah.
You do everything. You do the Christmas Eve, Christmas breakfast, all the presents, all the everything. But then by the end of that, to have to go cook another meal is like just it destroys you at that point. So a couple of years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, I decided with my wife, I was like, I want to make a new Christmas, holiday tradition, and I want to go to what is it, Japanese steakhouse or
Yes.
hibachi.
Yeah.
So we
There
go to
you go.
hibachi every year on Christmas. It
That's
makes it
great. I
so
love
easy.
that. No dishes. Yeah, I like that plan
Yeah,
a lot.
and leftovers, lots of leftovers.
Well, whoever started listening to this probably checked out by now. But we'll press on. So, Michael, I did want to. There's a number of topics I want to get into. We want to talk about scheduling, how Smart PM is kind of changing the game in terms of transparency for scheduling. We want to talk about some industry things, but I do like to kind of start from a history standpoint of like Michael Pink growing up. How did you get into scheduling specifically? Like, what was your path?
Oh, well, I went to college back in 1996. I became what's called an industrial engineer at Georgia Tech, which, it's about optimization and an efficiency type background, generally looking at processes and helping improve those processes, whether it's for a logistical network of trucks or like the airport design or any manufacturing facilities. But, I had gotten some background in college working in a construction company just to make some money. I was helping out the project managers and kind of crossed that with my educational background, and I received a job offer at KPMG in their construction consulting group, which at the time I was kind of iffy on what does this really mean. And interestingly enough, it just sort of, the first thing they did is send me to a Primavera training course because they needed me to understand how to look at Primavera schedules to help people understand their projects, usually after the fact, right? That was one of the data sets that we got a handle of when a project was late and over budget. And they needed me to be able to extract those files, understand those files, and build out an understanding of, from beginning to end, why did this job end up late and over budget. So I got very in tune with that data right out of college, and it sort of clicked, right? So if you're thinking about systemization and having a systems engineering background and getting involved in looking at data and construction, and the data that you got a handle of was pretty much the only data set that could systematize a project. It all sort of clicked. So that would be how I ended up getting very in tune with the industry, very in tune with this particular data set, and how I was able to find so much meaning from it.
Yeah, so scheduling was kind of your means of kind of taming the chaos that you were maybe interacting with. Is was that maybe an element of like your personal approach to life? Like, are you very much segmenting different portions of how to tackle different problems? Is that like scheduling was just one outlet of an approach that you've integrated into the rest of your life?
No, I would say generally speaking, yeah, I mean, I think that I know how to prioritize things. Like with all the little things that need to be going on, I kind of have a running tab in my head of what's a high priority and what's a low priority. And then as things become more, we'll call it critical in my own head, they become sort of the thing that's at the top of the list of things to get knocked off. So I would say in general, yeah, I've never thought about it that way, but I always think about all the moving parts that are going on. And I think that if you look at the scheduling data, there's a lot of different things that can be happening. There's some things that have low float and are critical. And then there's other things with plenty of room for delay or high float. And you sort of have to, prioritize based on that, because there's things that can cause disruption today. And then there's things that can cause disruption in a month. And you've got to sort of, with all the different moving parts of things going on in your life, you sort of have to juggle that around.
How many Gantt charts do you have in your personal life managing the different things going on in your life? Do you do you use P6 in your family life?
We use calendars, that's for sure.
Yeah.
My wife is a big planner, actually. She's very good at, making sure that all details are checked off, that all calendars are up to date. And then I'm the guy who kind of moves things around based on,
That's
what do
funny.
I have time
Yeah.
for and what's a high priority and what's a low priority. But I will tell you this, funny as enough, is pretty much every presentation that I do now, there's some sort of Gantt chart in there, whether it's for other business, whether it's talking to
Yeah.
our teams about go to market. I always show like what are we talking about over what time frame, and it's
Yeah.
always seemingly
It's
in the
fundamental.
form of a Gantt chart.
Yeah. It's a way of life. Scheduling. I like that. So you've got that background and you kind of come upon kind of this skill set at KPMG. Are you working mainly kind of on large like EPC kind of projects or what kind of projects are you interacting with at that point?
We were looking at a lot of different things. There was, obviously the large mega projects, all over the globe, but also being up in the Northeast, there'd be building projects, there'd be capital programs, there'd be claims that would come in that you'd be working on behalf of a sub or an insurance company or an owner or a GC. And they could be any type of project. I mean, when somebody was losing $5 million on a $30 million contract, it was worth it to them to call up a consultant that could rip through the data, you know, for a tenth of that, just to help them kind of understand what happened here and then use that information to help them negotiate. And that was where it became very interesting to me that somebody would lose $5 million and think it was worth $500,000 to hire a guy like me on something I wasn't even a part of.
Hmm.
And that's where it started to really trigger into my head that there's something broken here if this is the way this is normal for this industry.
Yeah. Right. Like you were always coming in at the end and you started to think like, hey, what if we started differently in terms of our approach to scheduling? Was that kind of the aha
Right.
moment
Well,
through those interactions?
yeah, I mean, that was the thing. It was like every single time I got involved in a job, I was like, okay, I have to go back to day one. I have to go back at day one and basically relive everything that you have access to. And the schedule is a very good vehicle for reliving the history of a project. And you just start to see, having one conversation with the customer, which is the team that's hired you to make sense of their project that they lived, that they didn't seem to be able to understand at the level that I could if I went through this process. And you got their opinions on one end, and you've got their data on the other. And I'm sort of looking at the data, listening to what they're saying, looking back at the data, listening to what they're saying, and they were incongruent, I guess is a good term. They were not aligned. The data was saying a different story than what they were telling me, which told me there was a misalignment of understanding. And what I also learned is the data was usually right. The data usually told a story that was correct, but there was also a lot of little um, breaches in the process as well that you can identify, that you can see when they're thinking this one thing, but the data is saying another. I started to see these misalignments and understand, through that over and over and over where the consistent breakdowns in the process were. And it always perplexed me why they wouldn't want to really understand this information sooner. And I guess what it really boiled down to is they didn't know how. And I knew how. I just knew that they didn't want to spend, consulting dollars on somebody to kind of watch their project as they go. So that led me into, well, what if technology did?
Hmm. So, and before we pull that thread, and you kind of answered this, but in the kind of breakdown between people versus process, it was typically a lack of expertise, a lack of know-how, or I guess maybe just a combination of the two, or did you see one being a bigger instigator of the issue as you were kind of going through those issues?
I would say that the scheduled data was useful. The process I saw is very useful. There was a lot of different beliefs and levels of understanding of what best practices are in the scheduling process. And there was also a lot of inability to synthesize that voluminous set of data into something that everyone could look at and understand and really communicate about. So what ended up happening is, the scheduling process would slowly fall apart based on impacts that were happening, and the knee-jerk response was to try to right the ship to your own detriment. And that seemed to be a pattern that was happening on basically everything I ever looked at. Does that make
So you
sense?
it does, yeah, and I guess it's interesting because you're going through this because this is your first job out of school, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it speaks to maybe, a little bit of more of a deeper thinker for you to be like, hey, I could probably solve this differently. But how many years between maybe that some of those initial aha moments and I mean, we can kind of go into the origin story of SmartPM, but how many years were you mulling this idea of like there is a better way to this?
It took about 6 years. I think it went from 2001 to 2007. I had looked at enough stuff to really say this is crazy how this industry is operating with this information, and I think I could help through automation of what I do. And then that got me thinking, but we didn't actually get a product into the market till 2019. So it was a 12-year span from the moment I was actually sitting on a plane flying back and forth between New York and San Francisco, going on a couple projects out there, and then having to come back for business school at NYU. And I was like, this is killing me, man. There's
I
got to
bet.
be a better way. I was
Yeah,
on this
right.
particular project, there was like 120 schedules and three different iterations of each. And it was just a mess. And I'm like, man, the fact that they're paying me all this money to be doing this thing, to be flying across the country back and forth on this mess of a project with hundreds of schedules, you know, there a computer needs to do this.
Yeah.
And that was just the beginning.
So Before we go into again, maybe origin story of Smart PM, when you were going through this and becoming really an expert in kind of CPM scheduling, were you, and maybe some of this comes down to like timeline, but like Tact, Last Planner, all those maybe adjacent tools in the arsenal of controlling risk, were those part of your kind of as you were approaching a project, were those in your tool chest, or were you mainly looking through the lens of CPM?
I was 100% looking through the lens of CPM, which I think is, I think tact and lean play off of that, but really I was looking at the big picture of a job, right? I mean, when you're thinking about building something, you've got to be able to look at all parts and pieces to get to the end and how they all sort of play off of each other. And then you can get into doing much more lean and tact planning based on what's happening in the field. And I believe that they should be two processes that work together. But the overall CPM one is the one that really helps you better understand what trades are causing what problems to what other trades and how is that resulting to delay to the job. And not just the trades, everything, the changes, the RFIs, the weather, submittals, fabrication. How do these all sort of play together in the big picture to ultimately result in additional time spent, and how do you capture information now of all the things happening, and how do you use that to predict future impacts that need to be accelerated upon now, things that you can't necessarily do when you're looking at it at the day-to-day field level. So it needs to be more of the big picture level, which is what I believe CPM to be mostly useful for.
Yeah, makes sense. So you're doing these kind of transnational flights. You're maybe thinking about how we do it differently. Did Smart PM start as a services oriented company then and then evolve into having a product, or was that part of the strategy of the product?
Yeah, no, it wasn't really part of the strategy. The situation that happened with me was, I started floating this idea out to some of the companies I was working at, saying, guys, there's a methodical process here that's an algorithm, right? That we can put into a technology to add a lot of value up front to sort of help control the outcome before it's too late. And, having worked for a lot of consultants that pretty much spent most of their time in the delay analysis and claims space, where I was trying to move upstream to the predictive analytics space, it was sort of a misalignment because they were used to getting heavily involved in the details after the fact, and I was more like, let's avoid all that. But they didn't really see eye to eye on my vision, and I had tried to make sense of this for years, but to no avail. They're like, we're not in the business of that. We're in the business of dealing with claims. And I'm like, well, what about claims avoidance? I think that's what our customers really want.
Yeah, right.
Right. And, it didn't work out, and I ended up leaving. They said, if I'm going to do any consulting, I'm going to go do this, more proactively instead of reactively. I see a means to not only helping people do this in real time and doing it very effectively, even manually, and doing it affordably, but down the road, I want to basically replace the need for a guy like me. So I left, and the first couple of years, I was fortunate enough to get put on a couple projects that were very nervous about having ridiculous overruns in claims, and I helped them stay out of that mess. But through that, I started to really deeply understand, if we're going to be successful here with this concept I've got to learn how to do this much more manually and really understand the customer a little bit more and really understand what I can provide them, to ultimately remove me from the equation. So I did that for a couple of years. And then back in about, that started in 2012. And then I guess from the years 2014 to 18, yes, we started building a product, and I started using it as a way to more quickly analyze the data on top of my service. And then once, we did a very intense customer discovery effort in 2017. To really understand, how do you remove the person like me, right? How do you take me out of the equation and just replace it with a software and let the user easily understand what to do with that information. And that's what we got, spent the last couple of years really crafting, what would it need to look and feel like to remove the middleman like me. And that's ultimately what we got to in 2019.
Yeah, and since then you've had a couple rounds of fundraising. I feel like in market, there's definitely been quite a few indicators of traction, which I think is exciting. And part of the conversation we had leading up to this was just how I think the market is really ready for some products like these, right? You've got, I think, an acknowledgement at maybe we'll say middle management layer and above that scheduling expertise really isn't what it really is needing to be at the project level. And so, how do we use tools to augment that experience and protect kind of corporate risk? Is that kind of how you're seeing maybe the last couple of years of just people responding to Smart PM because of those ingredients?
Yeah, I actually think it was interesting. I think there was this big wave of project management technology, right? And getting that into these contractors' hands was the first step. I think that opened up their eyes to two things. Number one, that we have access to data now. Number two, it still didn't solve the problem of delays. The statistics didn't change, like the technologies came, but the end dates are still taking time. And it took, that reality, also knowing that back in 2020, 2021, people started really keying in on their schedule data because of COVID. It came to be like a perfect storm in my mind of when the light bulb went off that we've been using this CPM stuff for 40 years and we're still late and over budget. Something's wrong.
Yeah.
And that sort of just really aligned with what I had been saying for a while. And yeah, just the mindset shifted a little bit and they started realizing that CPM does work. You just have to know how to work it. And they have there's like a limit to what you can do with that, but the data is very fruitful if you know how to organize it effectively. And there was a lot of companies that were trying to do that simultaneously with their project controls team. So I think it finally did hit a fever pitch, and we were had already built a product, so that the timing for us was very good.
Yeah. How do you guys avoid the pilot trap? I think there's some conversations going around how pilots, especially in construction, can really derail good kind of startups. And so we've talked also about just go-to-market innovation as kind of a productized thing in itself. But in terms of your go-to-market, how do you kind of seed understanding of your product in a way that can deliver value while avoiding kind of the trap of the endless pilot?
Yeah, that's such a good question because obviously when you're trying to bring a product into market, the company's going to buy the way that they're going to buy, especially with all the different solutions out there. A lot of them are point solutions that really trickle down to supporting the site teams. Whereas when you're starting to think about data management strategy, you need to be looking across your data first. So we sit in that place of being useful for aligning with your data management strategy, with schedule being to me some of the most important data you have access to, but also each site team should be empowered with that information as well in different ways. So we sort of have this twofold value prop, one at the operational level and one at the site level, which originally, companies were buying our product to, go try it out on a few projects and get feedback from the site teams. And, we've done well in that regard, even though it's a very risky proposition to go drop in, you know, something that exposes everything that we can in terms of risk on each specific project. And it's actually unfair to do it that way. To be able to jump right into the site teams and go, hey, your schedules aren't built well and your delays are happening here and you're responding by overly compressing and now your end date's not feasible. The reality is a lot of that behavior is trickling down from not having controls in place. So what I've started to do is make it very clear that I think that the right approach with any customer is to get a diagnosis of their collective data and really understand that across their portfolio or a region, a large portion of their portfolio, to show them that there's operational issues that are consistent across the board that you might want to start putting some procedures and controls around, but also identifying the highest risk projects that are going through the biggest challenges today to get the quickest time to value with our particular project. So we've started to make it much more appealing to do a full on data analysis as a starting point, and it also it makes it easier for operations to get a lay of the land of some of the issues and start to put a plan in place. And then instead of blindly selecting projects where people will feel vulnerable for being selected, they're actually selecting the projects where they have the most risk and can provide the most value to righting the ship immediately. And it seems to be, obviously to me, the ROI and the time to value is much quicker that way. And it's all about making sure that the teams that we're talking to, they've gotten used to purchasing a certain way, but it's probably better to be purchased this way as a starting point without intervening and getting a lot of understanding first before we craft an implementation.
So if I was a PX or maybe a regional VP listening to this, what would be my kind of pathway to value realization within SmartPM? Is it handing off, scheduled PDFs for a number of projects and then being able to look at some analytics across those? And maybe what would be some of those insights that you would be able to reflect?
Yeah, so what we would be able to do, and what if I was sitting in a GC right now and I was more on the operational side, VP of operations or a regional VP as well, or even a project executive, I'd be thinking about let's go get a handful of our projects. Don't pick them for any other reason than we just want to get a good lay of the land. And what we would need to do is pull all their schedule data, not the PDFs, but the actual XCRs or Microsoft project files that they have. First update, all subsequent updates, so the baseline and all updates for anywhere between 20 and 50 projects. And what we would do is we would consume that information. What we would also do is ask them to provide, some sort of meta tags to it. So what type of project is this? What location is it? What region is it in? What segment is it in? And we would then be able to look at all projects side by side from a schedule quality perspective. So we'd understand where they at, in terms of how well they prepare these schedules and what are the low hanging fruit issues that, if corrected at the operational level, would result in a lot less risk. And then we'd get into progress and performance analytics. So looking at, what sort of performance do they have at different, iterations of the job. So each updates its own little period of time. And we'd look at that side by side to figure out with each segment or each type of project or each region, what are the specific issues from a management perspective where we're being delayed or making decisions that are over compressing the schedule, or what sort of subcontractors based on whatever segment are generally causing the most disruption to our jobs, and where do these teams need to be empowered on managing these subs to ultimately come up with a game plan for managing risk effectively as well as managing projects effectively. But what we'd really see is a lot of different patterns here that would give them a game plan, a real strategy to start moving forward to become one that is extremely empowered through the schedule management process and successful because of it.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Is part of the maybe customer success approach on Smart PM being able to extract some of those insights, or is the platform fairly intuitive and that's just something that they would be able to see themselves?
Well, the platform's fairly intuitive, but when we get involved with a customer early on, it's really what we need to figure out is where is their level of sophistication when it comes to scheduling and schedule-based analytics. A company that has a project controls team, that takes scheduling very seriously. A lot of these companies have already started trying to build their own in-house systems, but they're struggling with that because there's a ceiling to it and it's a maintenance nightmare. What we do, depending on the group, we have to figure out what is their level of sophistication in this realm. And if there's somebody that's highly sophisticated, I mean, they literally can take this thing and run with it. Now, if we're dealing with like a mid-market GC that's never had a scheduler, never had a project controls team, all the PMs are doing the scheduling, the data's a little bit, it's a little bit messier. The process is a little bit, it's got a lot more room for improvement. So what we do is we guide them. And our whole goal is to figure out where are you at, where do you want to go, in what time frame, how much can we teach you over the next 3 6 months, and do you need some sort of supplementation, because we don't want to get into a relationship where you're not going to be successful. We know that there's a lot of, in some cases, some upfront education, so we have resources here for that, and we really try to meet the customer where they're at, try to help them, right the ships immediately with a lot of recommendations. And then, if necessary, we'll even provide support services to help do some of the heavy lifting to get them stabilized and then let them run from there. But in some cases, we don't need to even provide those resources because they have resources internally that can stabilize them.
Yeah. Changing directions a little bit. We've talked a little bit about just what it's like to kind of build a tech company in the construction industry and some of the different inputs and variables there. But you've recently raised around, there's some, I would say, some interesting conversations around the attractiveness of the AEC industry from a technology standpoint through the lens of venture capital. What are some of those conversations like at this point? Are VCs still as interested in kind of construction as they were kind of heading into 2022, 2023? Yeah, what's your experience been in terms of raising money in the industry?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different companies, and I got to a very important moment about a year and a half ago where I realized that, a lot of these companies that want to get into construction don't necessarily understand construction and its nuances, right? There's the generalist VC that looks at software, vertical software, SaaS, and thinks about it in a very specific way based on their experience, but didn't have much understanding of the differences of the construction industry. And there's plenty. So I learned that, unless they have invested in construction tech, they're probably not the right company for me to be sort of sitting on a board meeting with, trying to explain pricing models and user based versus project based and expansion potential and time to expansion and the whole land and expand model in a world of 2,000 different tools. But I did realize that there are very many VCs that are pretty much very focused on construction, and those are the ones to align with in the earliest days, like your Series A or your seed funding raising round. But once you get past that, which we have, it does seem as though you've got enough people that are sitting on your board that are very in tune with the industry. So it's not just you, the entrepreneur. And now it's time, as you're looking to scale and grow, to move into a growth equity round, which obviously it would be good to be working with a company that's got experience, some experience in construction. But this is where you get more into the generalized growth equity type organization. So I'm seeing, at least where we're at now, that it does probably make sense to start working with a company that would be helping us, accelerate and scale as quickly as possible. And they have a different set of skill sets that aren't construction focused, but more business and operational focused. So that's generally what I learned, is if I wouldn't do it any other way. In your early days, you've got to get a lot of good people that understand this industry and can help you solve problems about selling and pricing and marketing and connections as well. But once you get past that, then you can work with a more operational based VC that can help you scale.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Because I think even like we were talking about earlier, in terms of kind of go-to-market innovation and that being a driver for business success, I think what I've seen often too is a VC that invests in a construction tech startup that maybe doesn't understand the industry, specifically the go-to-market elements of the industry well enough, and actually breaks the product a little bit in how they push too early commercialization for a product that doesn't necessarily have product market fit, right? And what that can do to the kind of features that are pursued. So it's good advice to say, start kind of industry oriented from a VC standpoint and then kind of grow into the generalist. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I I got very close to a term sheet with a company that was going to be basically me and them and one third party sitting on the board. And through our negotiations of the term sheet, I realized they didn't really understand construction, and I just backed up real quick. I was like,
Yeah.
I need if I'm ever going to work with a VC, they really need to understand construction, at least where we're at now. And that's what ended up happening. We found a VC that focused 100% on construction. They completely understand. They had built their own construction company or products themselves, so they were very, very good at, and still are very helpful with where we were at as we were preparing for go to market. And we had already been through product market fit, but we were refining it a little bit. But yeah, I think the way that things sort of panned out for me have worked, very well in our favor.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about Smart PM and kind of your approach is there is this kind of value for value mentality, which is, not only are you looking to kind of solve a problem in market, but the approach to doing so is also there's an educational kind of parallel component where you're trying to offer services that not just services, but content and material to help people in their kind of scheduling journey. Can you want to speak a little more about kind of what you guys are doing on the education side?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that. As it became very apparent to us, especially in our early days, I mean, we were getting interest from owner side, developers and or large owners. We were getting interest from consultants. We were getting interest from insurance. We were getting interest from large E&R companies as well as mid-market GCs. To me, that made a lot of sense because I had worked for all of them in the past as a consultant. Everybody sort of has some sort of risk when it comes to a project getting done on time and on budget, but it's a different lens for that risk, right? And they have a different involvement in the process and also a different level of sophistication. So it was never going to be one size fits all. Like we couldn't just say, here's a product, turn it on, and yes, here you go. Now we do have one product, but there's different features and different value props for each feature that might align with one organization more so than the other, or even like one individual in an organization versus another individual in that organization. So we had to really understand, who are the people that are purchasing this? Why are they purchasing this? Where is their like what level of understanding do they have of this information? And then how quickly can we get them up to speed to align with, their value prop? And that spawned off a big learning exercise for us of saying, okay, well, these companies have a different view of the world and we need to align with that view, and that therefore we need to train and implement this a little bit differently. And we just started seeing some serious patterns in that regard. And the best example I have is the difference between the sophisticated E&R top 100 contractor to like the E&R 300 to 400 to what we'll call the middle market. As you move down that list, they slowly are getting less and less focused on project controls, analytics, and schedulers, and putting that responsibility into the hands of the PMs, which is creating this big disconnect between executives and PMs. So we just went right to the middle market and said, okay, these teams need to know a lot about scheduling just to even be successful, because the PMs have never taken, scheduling courses. They use Microsoft Project or Primavera to the best of their abilities and have never been taught best practices. And the executives, in some cases, don't understand that either. So we've got to come up with a training that can, get these teams up to speed, get the executives understanding our analytics and being able to communicate about how do we build better schedules, how do we make better decisions without anybody here that understands this subject matter. So we started doing this live, what we called a CPM and schedule analytics boot camp, and learning from it. And then having done that successfully with a lot of different companies, we started creating a knowledge base, like videos that we can provide them. And we've started creating a library of information related to upfront education on scheduling best practices, how that flows into analytics and analytics best practices, and how you can take this data to understand, the situation and then communicate with each other about. So we obviously had to go figure it out live in working with those customers, but then we wanted to bring it to more automation, right? And then the other piece that we did is take all that information that we get through all of our discussions and all of our customers, and we put it into a language learning model so that even in the product, you can ask it questions about certain things and it'll feed it back to you in layman's terms for your particular role.
It's fascinating. I mean, what I love about that isn't just, I think, the value that it offers a variety of different kind of tiers of the industry, but I think it also speaks to your workflow expertise, which I think is really critical when you're building a product. And I don't think enough products have enough workflow expertise kind of integrated or baked into how they approach, solving a problem. And I think there is value to solving a problem in isolation, but understanding all the ways that the surrounding ecosystem of tools and processes and workflows are impacted by the problem you're solving is really important. And so having a company like yourself understand that workflow to the extent that you can train is going to ultimately help how you solve that problem from a tooling standpoint, which I think is interesting. You mentioned kind of the large language model. What's like the crazy thing you think Smart PM could do in like 5, 7 years? Like when you look at just the roadmap of things, like is SmartPM.ai scheduling everything for me at some point?
I've been asked that a lot. Yeah, I think eventually, you know, we'll be working down the path of getting to as much automation as we can, but I would say there's two things that I'm focused on. Number one is pulling all the data together and assigning it through your scheduled data, right? Like I said, there's no data set out there that will organize all the things that need to happen in what order over what period of time and be able to analyze the nuances of how it's, what trade flows really represent, procurement versus design versus hard construction, how they all play together, how little RFIs and change orders and weather issues result in impacts, and how to respond to all of that ahead of the problem. But I think there's a certain level of information that we need to be pulling from the PM systems, that we need to be pulling from the cost and ERP systems that we're working on now. So I would like to be pretty much that place where you can plug many of your systems into one area and connect schedule, cost, PM data, as well as eventually design data in a meaningful manner that aligns with overcoming the challenges that exist in the construction process in general. Once you have all that information and have such an understanding of the interaction of all that data, you start to understand construction in very meaningful ways to support the estimating process, to support the procurement process, to de-risk jobs from a schedule and cost management process. So yeah, obviously at some point it can really start to be your one sense of truth of all things happening across all of your projects. And of course, at that point, you can probably get a lot of good recommendations, whether it's estimating recommendations, cost, resource recommendations, what size and type of subs to get on what type of project that will cause the least disruption, and also getting into building out plans that are optimal and then respond to real-time issues that impact them, and then come up with acceleration and mitigation strategies that work to keep them on time and on budget. So yeah, there's a lot, but I think it all starts with getting all the data in one place and looking at it, and then using that to better your business in all areas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a couple different threads there, but when you
Thank you.
look at AI and its potential impact, I think so often we start the conversation thinking about AI through the corporate lens that we're representing. And it's, looking at how our company can expand its profit margin, can expand its scale, leveraging AI, which I think makes sense. Commercially, we're in a capitalist society. It makes sense to start from that vantage point. But I think we're also all humans, and most of us are employees. And so when we start that conversation with maybe that lens first, human employee, and then kind of the corporate lens second, I think it changes the conversation a little bit, or it can change the conversation a little bit. Just thinking about what kind of future do we want? I don't know. I'm often, I would say, like an AI doomer. I don't mean to be, but I end up falling in that camp sometimes, mainly because I have little kids and I'm like, well, what's it going to look like for them in 20 years? But I don't know. Do you have any off the cuff thoughts on how we protect the human working class.
Yeah, I don't think AI is going to change things. I think it's only going to empower. I mean, if you think about construction, there's all these things that happen, right? One thing I learned about every job I've ever looked at is it wasn't one thing that happened that caused whatever happened, right? The overrun or it was like hundreds, right? The fact that, these AI models need to be trained based on data and every single project is its own sort of story and all decisions that are being made are based on experience. Those people have to look at the situation for what it is, and what AI can bring them is a lot of good ideas and a lot of good, ways of dealing with the challenges that are mounting up today to come up with a plan for the future of the job of uncertainty. That's the thing about construction. There's a lot of uncertainty on every single job, but there are a lot of patterns that you can get, right? There's a lot of patterns you can get on one job, or there's a lot of patterns you can get on 50 to 100 to 1,000. But there's no one size fits all for any single project because there's so many stakeholders involved. There's so many risk issues that are happening. And to take that data and understand it quickly would require a computer to help you get there. And that's where I think the value comes from artificial intelligence, knowing how to sort of cull through that information. But decisions still need to be made. And those decisions will be supported through analytics, but the decisions still need to be made. And that's going to require all the different parts and pieces that are still involved at all the different levels. So I think AI will only help this industry get much more optimal. And when I say optimal, I mean our goal as a company is to come up with a mechanism and a platform to assist you in ensuring that your projects are done on time and on budget and stay out of court, which is, right now, if you look back in history, it's a pretty big problem. We're looking to come up with standardized ways to help you achieve those goals, but we're not at all thinking about replacing anybody. It's all about taking information and bringing it to a level where all the parties involved can be on the same page and understand the risks for what they are and make decisions that support the group of stakeholders and make it much more collaborative in the process. And I think what that's going to do is it's going to make this industry a lot more appealing to work in. I think that given the amount of stress that is perceived in this industry and the amount of people who've just been burnt out and look back and say, I'm so tired. I think that this industry becomes more industrialized, becomes more systematized, becomes more standardized, and a lot more attractive just due to the fact that it's not as stressful.
I like it. I'll make sure to call you whenever I'm becoming too AI doomer. My right perspective. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think there is it does seem like there's a lot of different ways and paths that we could still go down in terms of how we leverage all of these technologies. I do always think though, if we look at some of the longitudinal studies done on the impact of smartphones on human brain activity, it's pretty detrimental. We're statistically dumber than we used to be prior to the smartphones. And so I
Hmm.
think there is a way in which our brain, I think, is changing. And we can talk about maybe elevating the kinds of interactions that humans have on these projects to be more strategic. But I think there is also just from a brain activity standpoint, we're probably not trending in the right direction. But I think that is one of the reasons I like that education is part of your approach to the market, which is we've got a tool that is going to help provide the transparency into your schedule that all levels of your company needs to make good decisions. But along the way, you're not going to get to where you need to be unless your people have a core understanding of CPM scheduling and all the different varieties. I think having kind of approaching the market in that way, I think is really holistic, and I can appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate you recognizing that. One of the things that I learned a while ago was, especially when it came into scheduling, like nobody no like going over the last 40 years, you can't just walk in and say, "Hey, here's a schedule, go build it," right? They're going to say, "No, you know nothing about my business and maybe I'll take a template and I'll work on it a little bit, but nobody out there is going to trust a computer knows how to do anything better." And there's different means and methods, right? And the reality that there's different means and methods means that the stakeholders involved and the employees at those firms believe in what they're doing and the way in which they do it. So the only way to reach and actually succeed with technology is not to come in and try to replace, it's to come in and try to empower and to meet them where they're at, wherever they're at. And I don't know, yeah, I'm not, I don't view a world ever existing where somebody puts a design together and then a bunch of schedules print out and then a bunch of robots show up and build the thing. There's a very human element to construction, and there's a lot of decisions that need to be made along the way. And where we were lacking was having enough information to make sure that we were making the best decision with the least risk to support all the parties. And there's a long time to get there. And I don't think, I think AI is only going to help that.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, and it's this idea of like elevating everyone's kind of inner craftsman, right? I think we're an industry of craftsmen, and I think at times all of the poor communication strategies, the silos we create, it takes away from the craftsman's ability to kind of provide their, we'll call it art to the world. And being able to remove some of that noise and get back to everyone, be able to kind of put their craftsman stamp on a project, I think is key. But hey, Michael, I know we're running out of time. Anything else before we go?
No, other than I appreciate the time. I enjoyed this conversation. And thanks
Yeah, I
for
did as
including me.
well. Yeah, thanks, Michael.